Uh, at the end of last Friday's presentation, I announced that I would review my term of office as the founding dean of the professional school in Los Angeles, and I will do that today, plus some other things if I have time. To repeat something I think I said before, I was chosen to open the campus the year before it opened, and then I served for 7 years as the active leader of that program. And it was probably the most challenging, the hardest, and the both worthwhile and torturesome 7 years of my life, either before or after. I'm still reeling for what I lived through. So let me start with what was very satisfying about it. Uh, I like trying to take a dream of moving the training of psychologists out of the hands of academics who themselves did not practice very much or very often, but had theories about practice, and move it away for the people who had the theories to take responsibility for those of us who were in practice to train the oncoming generations that would follow us and to allow practitioners to be the role models and teachers of people as well as following our own practice lives. That was one of the requirements for any faculty member in the institution. The faculty member had to be a licensed person who had a psychology license and either full or part-time was engaged in practice as well as the teaching activities. I liked the philosophy and I liked how we implemented it. I liked our curriculum. I also believe that we were serving a very, very important social purpose, that we were providing a path to a career for many people who could not do it because the universities were failing them. And there were practical things that I put into place that I felt very, very proud about. The first thing I did as I organized the early weeks of campus life was to decide I was not going to be an autocratic leader. I was going to try to lead by consensus if I possibly could. So the campus was administered by what I called a management team. On the team were three staff people, myself, three students, and three faculty members, because each of those parts of the organism had their own self-interest and their own problems and their own aspirations. And I thought it would be good as the final decision maker if my decisions every week were guided by what I heard of the perspectives and the needs of other parts of the campus. So we met for 2 hours every Tuesday, and I kept a list of what the decisions confronting me were, and I passed out materials in advance of those meetings, sometimes to the participants, and other times we just winged it. But I tried to govern by consensus. I tried to bring everybody together. I was able to do that about 80% of the time. There were bitter differences about some of the issues, and I had to be the final decision maker and know I was going to hurt some people, piss some people off, disappoint some people, and I would choose who I was going to do that to, but I would make the best decision I could when I had to do it without consensus. I was so happy that most of the time the consensus flowed and we could move forward in harmony with each other. The second thing I did was that I liked a lot was I called into being a Friday night at the movies class. It was a class that was both a class in developmental psychology, one semester it was a class in psychopathology, filmmaking, and it was also open to the public and to the profession. Members of the profession could come and they could get continuing education credit for watching the movie and listening to the discussion that I hosted afterwards. Students could get course credit if they came every week. And members of the public could just come and listen to watch the movies. And then the panel consisted of myself, my best friend, Martin Berkowitz, who was a practicing psychologist, and he was a movie lover, as was I, and one of our other friends, Barry Oranger, who was a writer and producer of very successful television shows. So the three of us would talk about the movie from our respective perspectives. And Barry would add his comments about what was noteworthy about the movie making in a particular film. It was really wonderful. Our conversations usually went on for an hour and a half with each other after the film was over, and then all of us and our wives, the three of us and our wives, would go have a very late dinner because we'd been busy getting ready to show the movie and watch it and then talk about it. And we had none of us had eaten dinner by the time we were all finished with that. I still think with great fondness on the 2.5 years that class ran every semester and all the wonderful films we watch. I would write the movie notes and I'd have a handout ready for people when they showed up for the film. Students loved it. The members of the public who came loved it. We were able to get the donation of the auditorium at Cedar Sinai, which has a projection room, fortunately, and we rented two 16 millimeter projectors. There were no DVDs back then, or other kinds of digital projectors. So we actually had film. We had 16 millimeter versions of the movies. There were places in Hollywood you could rent these from for home use, and we did, and it was wonderful. So I like that a lot. I also liked being able to turn around what a doctoral dissertation was. Traditionally, a doctoral dissertation is a piece of empirical work that's done, and there are statistical manipulations of the data, and conclusions are drawn. Uh, it's the model that every graduate school in psychology follows. By these criteria and credentials, Sigmund Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams, would not have qualified as a doctoral dissertation. So on our campus, we opened it up. Any meaningful and original contribution to the literature of whatever kind, whether it be an empirical study, whether it be a theoretical and conceptual contribution, whether it be an in-depth case study of some kind, whether it be a suggestion about applications of psychology to underserved populations that weren't being served, whatever it was that was creative, original, and worthwhile could qualify as a doctoral dissertation. And I was very happy with the vast array of things that got generated as doctoral dissertations. Finally, I like the fact that at every level, our students were out in some laboratory experience, leading to a practicum experience, leading to two half-time internships, so that they were not only studying on campus, but whatever they were studying on campus, they were messing around with real people somewhere in the surrounding environment with. And I was proud of the fact that we had cultivated relationships with over 40 different settings in the greater Los Angeles area where at least one of our students was doing something there that was a good learning experience and it was of some value to the community. And of course, my biggest pride was those damn 13 site visits and moving along with making the program legitimate, getting recognition to grant degrees from the State Department of Education, getting the Board of Psychology to agree that we were giving quality education to students and that they could sit for the licensing exam when they had gotten their degree from us and the hours that were needed to qualify for sitting for the licensure exam, that we convinced the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, our regional accrediting body, that we were listening to them. We were trying to meet all their criteria, and we moved from being what was called a correspondent, a program that announced its intention to seek accreditation, to being provisionally accredited after 3 years, and then moving in the sixth year towards securing our full accreditation, which we did. And that's a story in itself that really defines what happened to my sinecure as the campus dean. I did not fail. I even by the time I left office had opened up a relationship with the American Psychological Association, and we had achieved provisional recognition from the American Psychological Association. They wanted to come back in what would have been year 8 They gave us a bunch of advisories of things they want us to do to get our full accreditation, but I had every reason to believe that that was going to happen, but I didn't happen to be dean any longer when the final hurdle was jumped over and the final brick was put in place of building a legitimate institution. Getting regional accreditation was really wonderful too, because it meant I had to expand my student affairs office because now we were eligible to give federal financial aid. So we had to add a staff position, we had to add a financial aid officer, and at last we could give students some scholarship money and some loan money and some work study money and practical things that would help a larger number of disadvantaged people come and get their education with us. That felt wonderful too. Now, I had many nightmare moments. I have a list of them here. The first one came from the fact that two of my partners in our private practice, group private practice, came to be very significant people in the new professional school. Of course, I would turn to them. I work with them every day, and I admired their particular capabilities. The first one was Daniel Golden. He was the kind of business partner of our practice group. He hired and fired secretaries if we were unhappy with them. He negotiated leases when it was time to negotiate leases. And he pulled together something really wonderful for us. We were in a very large medical building. He went from medical building to medical building saying, to each of the docs he talked to or the medical groups he talked to, you know, we're wasting money paying rent. Is there any way you guys would come and we'll put together a huge partnership of all the tenants in the building and we will buy the building and we will become the owners of the building and we will be paying rent to ourselves and being able to distribute profits that ordinarily go to the current owners of the building. And he shepherded us, and I wound up as a part owner of the medical building because I was in practice with him. He brought it to fruition and into being. And I thought that was wonderful. So he became my business person when the school opened. I was not good at creating budgets, being able to think through the budgeting process, putting costs on things. He was great at that. So he became my assistant dean for administration, and he helped hire and fire staff people also. And I didn't have to do that all by myself. And I lean on him very hard. The problem with him occurred, as it did for me, in the second year of existence. The Western Association informed us that at least half to 60% of the faculty had to be full time in the institution if we were to get full accreditation. It needed a core of full time faculty members, and most of the senior administrators would have to be full time employees of the institution too. So that made my and I worried about I had to close down a significant portion of my practice in order to transition into being, and he would have to do the same thing. And the school had by that time had somebody like him on the other campuses. None of them were full-time psychologists who've been used to being in full-time practice. They were usually young MBAs just out of graduate school, or they were people who had been accountants and decided they would like to get into a private school like this and simply take over the bookkeeping, budgeting duties, and a whole bunch of other things that they knew something about. And his salary back then, what he was making in practice and what I was making in practice, were between $80,000 and $90,000, which was a lot more money back then than what we were paying people to do the administrative tasks. And I figured out that I had a working wife. I could take a salary cut and I could keep some of my practice. I didn't want to abandon my clients either. So I started working like a dog. I would see people 2 evenings a week after I got home two evenings a week I was seeing clients, and I was seeing them most of the day on Saturdays and Sundays too. So I could keep a third of my practice open and still be the full-time dean of the program. And he didn't have the energy to do that. He was 10 years older than I was. So I bit another bullet, and nobody except my wife knew this. I said to her, Dan is really important to me. The school is not going to give him the salary that he deserves, and he's not energetic enough to work as many hours as I am keeping a practice going. I am going to give him some of my salary. I'll do it on the side. It'll be a deal between the two of us. Each paycheck that I get, I'll write him my own personal check for what he needs to come up to some reasonable level. And I did that for 4 years after we made that bargain. He stayed in place for 4 years. Uh, it couldn't go on. Uh, Central office was growing. Nicholas Cummings was adding staff up there. More functions were being centralized in central office. The way we did budgeting was we figured out what we need to run our educational program, and we were told we had to do that within X number of dollars because there were now 4 campuses. Each of the campus had to give 1/4 of what the central office budget was. We had to ship it off the campus, 1/4 of that number up to San Francisco, so they would have their budget up there. They had no income stream of their own. The only income stream was the tuition that students were paying and any grants we could get. So each of the campuses was shipping money up there, and it became harder and harder to reach their number. We would be asked to tighten belts here and tighten belts there and do without this and do without that on the campus, so central office could continue to flourish, and it felt lousy. That was one of the things my faculty was angry at me with all the time, that I was selling out and supporting Nicholas Cummings, the president, in style where he should be raising money for us rather than we have to uh, carve money out of the campus budget and send it up to him to live his lavish lifestyle. I took shit for that, that I was accommodating him and allowing the money to be sent there. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't feel like I had an option. But each year, as we tried to tighten belts to accommodate the growth of central office, one thing became very apparent to me. I could get somebody to replace Daniel Golden for a lot less than it was costing me. And I finally decided I couldn't identify enough places to save money and couldn't identify potential sources of income that we could start ourselves and maybe make some money on the side. And I had to cut my budget for that year. So I called into my office and I said, I'm really sorry to do this to you, but you're going to have to give up your administrative post. I'm not going to let you hurt too badly. You can become a full-time faculty member and make a faculty salary, which is almost as much as what your administrative salary was. And you could stay there and start rebuilding your practice in whatever form you want to, until you get your dollars back in whatever way you're going to do that. And he was furious with me. I was assassinating what a person who had probably been my second best friend up until then. And it was the parting of the ways between us. He was always sullen. He did what I suggested to him just to cushion himself financially. He wouldn't even talk to me when I passed him in the halls. He always looked at me with hatred after that. And when it was time to go, he was one of the ones leading the charge to get rid of me. And I understand that from a human perspective, but it really hurt like hell because I had valued him. I had tried to take care of him, and I had done the best I could for as long as I could, but it wasn't right by him and it wasn't good enough for him. And I didn't honor him sufficiently. And I lost his friendship and I gathered his animosity. The second person who caused me trouble was my other partner. He had been the person who I had replaced. He had been the person who had been picked to be the dean, but had chosen to be the president of the California Psychological Association instead of the founding dean and direct his energies that way. But I knew he was very gracious and good with people. His name was Carl Pothorst, and I trusted him to be the director of field training for the campus. He was going to arrange to find the various settings in which our students would go for practical experience, to maintain liaison with them, and I would give him enough faculty staff time so that he would have faculty members who would make visits to the sites, talk to them. He didn't have to do that all himself because it became huge and very unwieldy for any one person, but he would have faculty help doing it. So he had his own little empire, the field placement office and its staff. And I had big aspirations for that office. First of all, when I had gone to graduate school, there was a and the American Psychological Association not only encourages this, but becomes one of the things that accreditation hinges on. If you're doing skill training, then there should be a close relationship between the faculty of the program and the people doing the skill training out in the community. There should be close liaison. There should be a liaison person who goes. That person should make visits often. That person could even participate in training experiences in the setting. Since all of them were faculty members visiting the setting, they could teach the seminars for the staff in various topics or give colloquia or consult in some way. That mutual back and forth between the field setting and the campus was to be an important part of our campus life, and it would help us get our final APA accreditation. Well, it didn't happen that way. He himself never went to visit any place. He was busy still running his practice, and the young faculty members he got to do that, they weren't terribly interested. They would show up in a perfunctory fashion for maybe a half hour once a month, and they would walk in and say, "Everything okay here?" And the director of the place say, "Yeah, everything's fine. No problem, no problems. Okay, I'll be back next month." And they would consider that discharging their mission. And I was constantly trying to have conversations with him to change that culture. And he said, "Why? There's no problems. The Western Association of Schools and Colleges is happy with what we do. When we have when they hold site visits, the field directors come in and they say we're sending them the good students and things are working out fine. And don't make problems where there's no problems," he would tell me. And I wanted to have an excellent program. That was my biggest problem constantly. I wanted the program to be excellent. Boy, did that get me in trouble. It got me fired finally. I could not tolerate ordinariness. I could not tolerate mediocrity. And he was the second part of what was wrong. Then I had just bizarre experiences blow up in my face. I had an assistant dean for student affairs, a female psychologist I knew not terribly well, but I always liked her, and she volunteered to mentor students when we first got started. And she seemed to do a nice job at it. I thought she should be the administrator charged with that whole area of life. She would do disciplinary problems we had with students. She would give lectures to prospective students. She would arrange site visits for them. She would help faculty members to deal with anybody who was causing problems. If they had learning difficulties, she would work with that. She was going to do everything to try and make student life smoother and better, whatever she could. Unbeknownst to me, she started having a love affair with one of the students. And unbeknownst to me, both of them had significant drinking problems. What I did know was our site at the Elks building was a multi-purpose strange site. And because the Elks held their meetings there, among other things, they were happy. There was a bar on the first floor in the Elks building, and it was open to the public as well as the Elks. And frequently, at the end of the working day, my assistant dean for student affairs and her male lover would go down to the bar and hang out there and smooch a little and get drunk. And one night they had a horrible fight, and she started beating him, and the police were summoned, and she got arrested for assaulting my graduate student. And It boggled my mind. I couldn't tolerate having her as my assistant dean for student affairs anymore. She had crossed boundaries. She had no business starting a love affair with him. She had no business getting so drunk. She had no business assaulting one of her students who supposedly she was supposed to be watching over. So I summarily relieved her of her position. And I was without, it took me almost a year to find a good replacement for her. And I was still reeling. How could this happen? This was crazy. Am I running a crazy house here? What kind of place is this I'm in charge of? Oh, and then I had a problem with a colleague named Rogers Wright. Uh, he was named after the ball player, Rogers Hornsby Wright, who was a big All American ball player in the 1920s. I guess Rog was born in the late 1920s when Rogers Hornsby Wright was still playing ball. So he was named after him. And Rogers Wright was born in the Ozarks. He spoke with a southern accent and he prided himself on being an Ozarks hillbilly. And he became a very significant person in our profession. He had been trained, I forgot where, which university, he'd been trained as a child psychologist, and he was in practice with a pediatrician, actually. He had an office in the pediatrician's office, and they were in a kind of partnership where the pediatrician was his prime source of referral, would identify kids with one sort or another family problem, and Rogers would do the psychotherapy. Uh, he was also engaged in insurance fraud, I found out. But back then, we didn't even know what insurance fraud was. What would happen was some of the patients of the pediatrician had health insurance, and Raj was doing the psychotherapy. So the pediatrician would fill out the insurance claim forms as if he were, and sign them as if he were the person that was rendering services, but it was actually Raj who was the person who was rendering the services. And they had that symbiotic relationship with them. And I don't know. I was the naive one. I didn't see anything wrong with it for the longest time, and I either they didn't care because that they knew something was wrong with it. They continued doing it. And I knew, and he was offering this as a model of what all of us should do. As a matter of fact, get a friendly psychiatrist or somebody else to sign the insurance claim form because we're not eligible to do that. He caused me trouble though in a really agonizing fashion. Part of the curriculum was that students have at least 45 hours of face-to-face individual psychotherapy as a condition of their being granted their degree ultimately. If they had had psychotherapy before they started, they could petition to have that recognized. Maybe we would. Maybe we would want the psychotherapy to be closer to their actually learning to do psychotherapy so they could feel what it felt like to be the client at the same time, they were learning what it was like to be the therapist. Maybe we should ask them to have new psychotherapy. I don't know. By the way, that was one of the provinces of the dean of student, assistant dean for student affairs to make those kinds of decisions about students. And in addition, we recruited as many volunteer therapists as we could from around the community who would see the students for no charge or very low charge for poor starving students. And Rogers had volunteered. He was in luck. If there are any students who are commuting from the southern part of the city or anywhere near Long Beach, I'd be happy to see them. And as a matter of fact, he was working with one of our students who was near the end of his career, supposedly working on his doctoral dissertation. His doctoral dissertation was a very original one. He had actually gotten a grant to do this dissertation, and his subjects were chimpanzees. I forgot what the topic was, but he had chimpanzees on the campus and was doing something with them, assessing them in some way. I don't know if it was a learning experiment, what the damn thing he was doing with the chimpanzees. But Seymour Zellen, who was the chair of the investigative track in the curriculum, was his dissertation chairperson because the student was not very good with research design nor with the statistics, and Seymour was kind of backstopping him and trying to help him out. And so the student was having a lot of trouble. Even with Seymour's help, he was not hitting sort of landmarks of how far along he should be when in his education. He had trouble with the subjects, some of them died. There was one reason after another why he was having trouble completing this. And Rogers Wright was his therapist. Now, Rogers Wright, of course, was hearing about all the troubles that the student was having getting the dissertation done, and the student's anxiety he wouldn't finish on time and he would be thrown out because he hadn't demonstrated sufficient capacity to do a good dissertation in a timely fashion. He was anxiety ridden about it. That tied him up in knots and made his performance go down even further and made him needier and needier for Cy Zellen's help, who was beginning to get somewhat annoyed with him. Try to tell him, here's what you need to do next, and the guy wouldn't understand clearly what to do. So it was unraveling with the student. And Raj, in his typical helpful fashion, said, "Why don't you let me read your proposal and read any notes you have on how far you've gotten?" So he provided them to his therapist for his therapist to read these materials. And the next thing I know, I'm getting a call from the president of the institution. Nicholas Cumming and Rogers Wright were deep AP, American Psychological Association, working partners and friends on a variety of different projects in the American Psychological Association. So Raj calls up Nick. He violates confidentiality. He had no permission from his uh, patient to discuss any of this with the president of the institution, but he did anyhow. And he said to Nick, "This guy is stupid. He's really stupid. He's incompetent. Please have him thrown out of school immediately." This is the guy's therapist telling the president of the institution to have the student thrown out of school. Nick calls me up, of course, and says, "You're the dean. What's happening here? I want a full report on my desk. You talk to Cy Zellen and tell him I want to hear everything he knows about this student's troubles with the dissertation." So I go to see Cy Zellen and said, "Your student is in trouble, I guess. His therapist has talked to the president, has talked to Nick Cummings. I'm supposed to get a report from you about what you know about the student's capabilities and his performance to date on his dissertation." And Cy Zellen was one of the most belligerent people I knew, and that made him explode. He said, "That fucker, that was unethical. He had no right to talk to the president of the institution. You go tell Nick Cummings to butt out of this. It's none of his goddamn business." And I'm not going to go to work on this and give him information about the student. What the student's doing is private with me, and it's going to stay with me. And I was back in the paper bag factory. I called Nick up and said, "Seymour Zeldin's not going to cooperate." Said, "Yes, he is. He works for you, and you tell him he's going to generate this thing, or you're going to fire him." So I told Seymour, Nicholas tells me to tell you that you're going to get fired if you don't comply with what he's asking you to do." And he said, "I don't give a fuck. You fire me, there are going to be 20 students in the graduating class are going to be in trouble. I'm their statistical consultant, and they can't do this by themselves. And your last year program is going to fall apart if you fire me. You really want to play that game with me? You tell him your last year program is going to fall apart if you fire Seymour Zellen." Well, it took me a month. I finally got them to talk to each other, and they wound up just screaming at each other. And I took Nick aside and I said, "You want to play hardball? Fire me. You run this place without me if you want to do that. And when I go, I'll tell you, I will report Rogers Wright to the Board of Psychology that he has behaved unethically as a therapist, and I'll report him to the Ethics Committee of the American Psychological Association. So you still want to tell me, and you want to tell Seymour Zeller to fire him?" Well, I am telling you, Nick shut up finally, but he was really unhappy with me. Rogers Wright remained bitter towards me. And he said, you are allowing somebody incompetent to enter the program. You're going to have to sleep with yourself every night of this." And I'm saying, "You're behaving unethically, and you are trying to assassinate the very person who goes to you for care. And I can't put up with that behavior." So that really made my life miserable in the institution. Uh, Finally, my final source of tension was I had a secretary who worked for me, and she was very helpful. Students would come saying they had a problem, and she understood the work in the institution. She could often buffer me and say, "I think you can do this. I'll ask my boss if that would be a reasonable solution." And 9 times out of 10, it was. So she was taking work off my plate. She was more than just a secretary. She was really a good problem solver. And then I decided that my students who were putting in so many hours now working, they were coming to the management team meeting every hour. Giving up 3 hours of their time, 2 hours of their time every week. They were often having to read documents to get ready to come and meaningfully participate. I decided I was going to create a course called organizational psychology, and they would get course credit for the time that they put in. That would be the field work they were doing for for the laboratory experience in the class, and I would open it as elective to other students who wanted to learn something about organizational psychology. And my formerly secretary, who is now my assistant, was her title, would come and team teach this with me because she understood a lot of what the inner workings of the staff in the joint was, and knew the problems that came up in our organization. The very campus would be the subject of the organizational psychology class. What are the defects? What are the problems? How can we problem solve them better? And she would team teach it with me. Well, she took this as a license that I was romantically interested in her, and that's why I'm advancing her, and that's why I'm team teaching with her. And she would flirt with me in class, and she would come. I would be sitting behind a desk, and she would come and sit next to me on the edge of the desk while we were talking to the students. And my wife kept warning me, "Watch out! This is getting complicated." Ah, no, what? And did get complicated. She made a serious pass at me. She said, "You need me as your mistress. You're missing a good thing here." And I had to struggle with that. Is this grounds for dismissing her? Could I contain this and put up with her? And I finally decided, no, this was getting out of hands, and I had to let go of her. And I told her I would give her a very good letter of recommendation because, from a work standpoint, she had been an excellent worker, and I would certainly talk about that. And she just wouldn't take no for an answer, though, and I couldn't have that kind of distraction in my life right now. So away she went, and my wife made sure that I hired a very happily married middle-aged woman whose children were just growing up, and she wanted to come back to work part-time, and she was very, very happily married and in a good family. So that was another problem I had to ride through. So how did my time as dean come to an end? It was very simple. We got our provisional accreditation from the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, and a list of things that needed to be attended to. We were told they were coming back in 2 years, I think it was. And here was a list of things that they want changed. The biggest one was they wanted much more autonomy vested in the four campuses. Each campus had some unique features. Each campus faculty had some strengths and some limitations. They wanted the campus deans to have much more authority to allow the campuses to evolve according to their natural talent and according to their some cities had better resources for traineeships in certain areas. So other campuses had facilities available to them focused on other kinds of human dilemmas. The campuses had to develop their unique identities, and the president had to take seriously his responsibility, the biggest one of which is to be a titular figurehead that solved problems that came up on the campuses, but left the campuses alone a lot, left the faculty alone to develop future curriculum changes. And His time was spent as in relations to the external world, being an advocate to the program, doing a lot of fundraising, building grant possibilities, building relationships with granting organizations. It was to be Mr. Outside. The current president was too involved in petty micromanaging of things inside, and he needed to turn outside. In addition, they told us we had to give up giving this ID degree, I mean the PhD degree, and start giving our graduates the degree of Doctor of Psychology rather than Doctor of Philosophy. They said it was accreditation policy all over the country that skill training programs that gave doctorates give the degree Doctor of the Profession. The PhD was reserved for scholarly departments in which the distinguishing characteristic of the faculty was that they did scholarly research. They got to do they were those programs gave the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The skill training was only a byproduct that was done for the purposes of raising some scholarly issues that were going to be researched. The traditional departments of psychology, of course, were going to go on giving the PhD degree. But the professional schools that were being born in many locations were being asked to give this ID degree. They had given us a variance when we were the only professional school. We pleaded with them that this is a new degree. There's only one other place in the country that a very small program with 12 students in it gives that degree, and that's for political purposes, so that place could exist where traditional Department of Psychology exists, and it won't threaten the department. It will obviously be those crazy persons out there doing something different than what the right mission is for psychologists. It was a political solution to a heated problem at the University of Illinois. It was not designed as a model for the whole nation. Let us alone. If you're going to require this of other programs as they come along, and we move in unison with them as the LLBs did to become JDs. If it's a thing that's happening everywhere in the profession, we'll join the march. But we don't want to have to carry the burden of breaking in a new degree and making it legitimate when it hasn't existed ever before. And they had to let us alone. But they were getting ready to say, if you want your full accreditation, it's time. There are now 15 other programs, either starting up on someplace in the country or on the drawing boards, and they've all agreed to give this ID degree. You're not going to be doing it alone. It's time. That was the last thing we had to agree to do. So when we got these reports on all the 4 campuses, the president said we need to have a retreat meeting. We need to get together on how we're going to respond to these requests that's being made of us in our next self-study. So let's bring your wives. I'll find a nice place and we'll go. So he found a hunting lodge on the slopes of Mount Lassen, the only remaining active volcano in the state of California, and brought us and our wives there. It was a very luxurious place. The surroundings were really very nice. And of course, he didn't bring his wife, he brought his mistress with him. And uh, we started to meet, and we decided we were going to attack the first difficulty, the first explosive thing, because the 4 of us had conferred with each other before we got there. The first one right after dinner on the first night, and Nick said he was tired and going to bed, and Mary, the name of his mistress, says going to. We said, Nick, we would like to have a private conversation just with you. There are some personnel issues. We don't think it's proper that Mary participate in the conversation. He said, well, everything I do, I'm going to talk with her. I said, that's fine. You may decide to talk to her about these matters. We just don't want to air them while she's here. And we asked Mary to please forgive us. We wanted an executive session with the president. So he agreed to stay up for an hour more. And we told him that Mary is causing havoc on the campuses, that there are going to be a lot of complaints about her at the time of the next self study because anybody who wants to talk to the visitors can ask to reserve time, be it a staff person, a student, or a faculty member. Anybody who's part of the campus community can ask to have personal time with the site visitors. And we said huge buckets of shit are going to be thrown at Mary Dunn from all four campuses. And we don't think that's a good way to start site visits. And please relieve her of her duties. You please keep her in your practice, keep her as your mistress. We don't care what you do with your private life, but find somebody else to fulfill the function she's filling in central office and have that person come and visit the campuses in a much more gracious fashion than she conducts herself. And he got really angry and he said, nobody's going to tell me how I'm going to staff my office. I said, please sleep on this. Here are things in writing. There has to be more autonomy for the campuses. This is one of the autonomies we want. We don't have to greet Mary, I won't use her last name, as your representative coming to campus, acting as if she had your voice. That's not a good thing. We're asking you to stop that. That's nowhere in the site visitors report, but we're telling you there's going to be trouble if you don't take care of this. We got up in the morning and we said, he said, well, we're going to fight the others. What others? We're going to fight for more time for not changing our degree. And we said, no, we don't think you should do that. We think their case is very convincing. You're jeopardizing our getting our final accreditation. They may demand this and give us 2 more years to change the degree and come back again, but they're not going to give us. They've made it very clear they're not going to give us our final accreditation if we don't listen to them. He said, we have to come up with arguments that are persuade them that our arguments are very strong and they should listen to our arguments and not their sense of the fitness thing. You want us to change their mind. Yes, well, it's our sense of what we're getting. They're not going to change their mind. Well, you report to me and you're going to listen to me. That didn't feel good. Finally, we get to the last thing. You have to take seriously what they're saying. Will you stop reading all applications for admission? Will you stop coming to the campuses and interviewing secretaries that we're hiring and not allowing us to interview a secretary unless you've interviewed them? Stop micromanaging. And look, we've grown hardly any increase in our reserve fund. It's still paper thin. You're not. We have what you call a board of community members. You have brought together some wealthy and influential people to take an interest in the school and to meet with school officials and learn about the school periodically, to visit the campuses and be well received, and presentations are made to them, but you haven't succeeded in raising any money out of them. Now, that you've been told that this is a significant part of your function, and it's an afterthought for you. It's not a significant part of your function. You love creating the school and watching it evolve and steering it. And please take your hands off the steering wheel and let other people have their own cars that they're steering, or we're not going to get our accreditation. And we argued with him hopelessly all the next day. And we were going to spend that whole day with him. Mary was there too, and she was of course supporting him. And she says, it's too early for me to let go. You have to come up. Look, you guys are going to have to write self-studies for your campuses. You're going to have to write them why their advice is too precipitous and too soon, and why I have to continue being a steady influence, a steadying influence for at least a few more years to come. And we said, we can write it. They're not going to believe us. They visited us already. They see what's going on. That's why we got these recommendations. There are complaints about your heavy hand coming from everywhere, coming from faculty members, coming from some of my administrators. They don't want to have you on coming to the campus every week, trying to find things to put your nose into and trying to find things to instruct us to change. That's my job to do that. And And where is the money you're supposed to be raising? It's going to be hard to justify why there's been so little. So we left at an impasse. He said, "You have your assignments. You're filing those self studies 6 months before they're due, and before the site visit, and I want them a year before. You have the rest of this year to get them with the justifications that I've asked you to provide, and put them in my hands, and I'll tell you how you will go about improving them, or give you some additional arguments if you haven't covered all the bases creatively and effectively and loudly enough." And I was in the car. I had come from the airport in a rental car with the dean of the San Diego campus, and his wife and my wife and myself. And we were so damn depressed. We didn't know what we were going to do. We thought he was wrecking the ship again, and this was not going to work. And he was putting off our final accreditation, and that was terrible because the foot bone's connected to the ankle bone. In order to get APA final approval, one has to be a fully accredited institution. So this was going to stall having APA come to look at us too, because we didn't have the chips to put on the table to enter the game with the APA, to finish the game with APA. We had no more chips to ante up. What the fuck are we going to do? So we would decided we would have a conference call with each other. We would just sit with our misery for a week and have a conference call, the four of us, and we did. And uh, I forgot whose recommendation it was or whose idea it is. And one of us, it may have been me. I don't remember. I won't take credit for it because I don't remember for sure. But the plan was we were going to present the board of directors with signed resignations that unless they negotiated Nicholas Cumming out of his contract as president of the institution, the faculty and senior administrators on all the campuses were going to resign. They would have a school with only students and no faculty to teach them and no administrators to run the program. And as a matter of fact, we would, as best we could, open a competing institution. The faculties and the administrators would go rent space somewhere, even if we had to use our personal funds. We would open a bank account and we would tell the students if they wanted to transfer to this new entity that we were making, we would give them transfer credit for everything they had done at CSPP, and they could continue their education with us. But we would warn them again. We had no idea whether we would be get permission to grant degrees or to have them sit for the licensing exam. They would be taking a risk if they came with us, and we would understand if they wanted to stay at CSPP and see what the board of trustees could work out to continue their educations. But they would have to do it with suddenly no faculty and no administration. What an audacious thing to do. So we started caballing how we would do this. We would have secret meetings with our faculties first to tell them what the plan was and to ask for their cooperation and to see if they were willing. And we would not compel anybody who wanted to stay with the wreckage that we would be creating, and have the board of directors was on the hook financially for them. They had guaranteed, all these people had contracts. If they wanted to stay and just see how their contracts were going to be paid, they could. But we thought if push came to shove and it was you must choose or the place is going to go through this kind of torment and wreckage, that they would align with us because they could do without a president, but they couldn't do without an administration and a faculty very well. That would cause too much havoc, and they would finally come to their senses and pick us and fire Nick. So the time of the next board of directors meeting came. We had all the signatures, and 24 hours before that was to go out, we had couriers hand deliver a statement of resignation, the signed copies of the signed documents, and a statement of our intent to open a competing institution if they didn't honor our wishes, and tell them they needed to make this the first item of business on their agenda tomorrow, because after tomorrow, if they didn't successfully agree with us, that we would be gone. It was their last chance. They had one day, and uh, the only members of the student body who heard about this was the governance of the place was very romantic too. The board of trustees consisted of four members of the State Psychological Association, four student members, one from each of the campuses, and four faculty members, one for each of the campuses. The faculty members already knew what was coming down, of course. The students didn't. So each of us called our board of directors member student aside and had a personal conversation with them and swore them to secrecy until the board meeting. They were not to gossip about any part of this to their fellow students. I'm sorry, we apologize that they would have to carry a lot of tension and uncertainty in them. We asked them to be professional, carry it. We told them 48 hours before the board meeting and show up for the board meeting. Well, I'm almost out of time. The board meeting was horrible. The deans were asked to step outside, and so was the president. All of us were not members of the board. They went into executive session and they found a hotel room for each of us to cool our heels in. Nick was in one hotel room with his girlfriend, and the four deans were in another hotel room, pacing around, talking to each other, wondering what the hell was going on in the boardroom. After a while, a negotiating committee from the board had been appointed. The chairman of the board, Rogers Wright, was on the board then. He was a member of the negotiating committee too, and he tried to see if we would soften in any way. Were there any conditions that they could take to Nicholas Cummings that would get Nicholas Cummings to be allowed to remain, as far as we were concerned? And we said he knows what they are. We tried to do that with him before. And we showed them what was in the reports from the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. He has to agree to turn over leadership on the campuses to his dean. He has to allow the faculty to become responsible for future changes in the curriculum. He has to stop micromanaging the administrative staff, and he has to turn most of his energy into fundraising. We said, frankly, we think we would be better off by getting a new president who wants to be the fundraiser for the institution and who's done a lot of successful fundraising than trying to rehabilitate Nicholas Cummings to become something he isn't. And we were pretty hardball with them, and he was hardball with them too. He said, "I founded this place. I have been in charge of it. It is succeeded beyond our fondest dreams. Please bear with me for another couple years. I know I can pull this one off, and if, you may have to fire the deans because they're not willing to do the work I'm assigning to them. Replace the deans, and they will write the new deans will write the right kinds of self study justifying why these changes are premature and should not be made." And late in the day, they finally decided that they were going to side with us. It was too chaotic not to. And we all stayed till 7 o'clock. They negotiated the terms and conditions of his leaving. What kind of public statement would be made? What kind of monies would be given to him? They found a role for him as a consultant to the board so he could continue to meddle in the life of the place. And he finally agreed to give up the reins. Boy, did he hate us. Oh my God, was his relationship with us frayed forevermore. And I lasted 2 more years beyond that. That happened in the fifth year. And this will be a minor time. The new president who was hired managed to assassinate me and the other three campus deans as well before he had been in residence with us for more than 2 years. He found ways to get rid of us, and on the school went without me. But that's a topic for another time. Next week, I know what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to get back to professional issues. I have a really touching and beautiful case that was part of my practice in those early years where I was going through such turbulence at CSPP. So I'll pick up that theme. And I want to talk about, if I have time, the beginning of my presentation on creating step families with liberal illustrations from my own personal life, as well as some from the lives of some of my clients. So that's it for today. And my baleful tale has been told, and the floor is open.
I have a quick technical question, Arthur. If the status of degrees would be defined by WASC and APA accreditation, would the students who matriculated prior to that be able to practice?
Yes.
They would be. Okay.
Yes, the particular degree that's specified that people have is not specified as a requirement for licensure because licensure in most states, as it is in California, is generic. There are applied research psychologists who have the PhD degree who are licensed psychologists, but they don't do the kind of work we do. The control is to have a degree appropriate to the work. And at the time that elders like me got the degree, the only degree in the field was the PhD degree. So I have a PhD degree, and that's fine. Board of Psychology doesn't care about that. It's no constraint on practice.
Hmm.
Doing what
Okay.
you've been trained for is the constraint on practice, not the
Hmm.
degree you have.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay.
Is that the only thing you have in your mind at this moment?
Well, that was one thing.
Okay. You want to go at me again, or should I turn to Aaron for the
Go to
moment?
Aaron.
Okay, Aaron, what's on your mind?
I was just like maybe an observation. There's a theme in your life of saying yes. You know, you say yes to a second marriage after a difficult marriage, yes to starting this crazy school, and then being assassinated. I'm wondering if those experiences of saying yes have blunted, do you think, your ability to continue to say yes to these
No,
kind
if
of,
if something interesting and potentially very valuable shows up, I'll embrace it.
yeah, that's something I've always admired in you.
Thank you. I am Don Quixote. If I see a windmill, I'll pull out the lance and go attack it.
Does
And
that
I,
mean does
I'm
that mean
feeling.
you're delusional?
No, I'm feeling good today. There is a literature in organizational psychology. Since I created a course in it, I started reading some of the literature that says it is charismatic and energetic people who come up with new innovations and start new enterprises. And as the enterprises grow, flourish, and move towards their next stage of development, they usually let go or have to let go because ordinary managers who know how to deal with things in a steady state come forward and take over. So I began to feel I was only part of a mystical process that takes place in almost any organization. And I should view my assassination as growth pains and the moving on of the institution. And I do today, by the way, as I tell this story, I feel glorious. I don't regret what I did. I regret the suffering I went through. It was painful often. But I think I did a beautiful thing. I made the world better by standing in and bearing that pain and struggling with all the craziness I had to put up with and all the disappointments and all the hard work. And finally, even being assassinated. It was worthwhile. I don't regret it.
This is ridiculously healthy, this framing of the whole thing, and I would encourage you to really learn how to grab hold of bitterness.
Hmm. Hmm.
No, I'm not good. I'm not good at holding grudges. I worked later with many of the people who had come together to assassinate me, and I worked without rancor with them.
Very good.
Oh,
that
if you want a piece of gossip, my best friend in the American Psychological Association volunteer structure was a New York psychologist named Stanley Graham. And
mhm.
in the same year, both of us decided we were going to run for president of APA together. And he had much better resources than I did. He was a very wealthy man, so he had kind of direct mail campaigns. And in his literature, he lied about the conversations we had had and what I stood for. He was like Trump. He was just lying to get elected. And he said we were running in tandem, and APA uses the hair system where your first place vote, if that person, you get the least first place votes, then your second place votes are given to the remaining people in the race. You drop out. He was telling people we had an agreement that my followers were to be told to give him my second place votes, and his followers were going to give me his second place votes. And that was all horseshit too. We had no such agreement. And as a matter of fact, he broke many promises to me in his electioneering. And he switched positions on things that we had an agreement with, not only with ourselves, but other people in the association. APA at that point was on the cusp of the scientists and the practitioners breaking apart and it breaking down into two separate organizations again, like it had been in the 1930s. And I was opposed to that. I wanted to hold us together. And he agreed he was going to fight to hold us together. That was one of his presidential planks. And he discovered he could get votes from the scientists by changing positions on that. And he changed his positions and lied about it. So he betrayed me and assassinated me, and he did get elected president. I didn't hold him any rancor. He's a much better politician than I am. He was willing to not lie, cheat, and steal to get the position, and was fine with me. I wound up as his parliamentarian. I sat on the podium next to him in the year of his presidency, and advising him on how to run his meetings in an orderly fashion. I don't hold bitterness long, except for my former wife. I managed to keep that going for my whole life, so maybe you should be proud of me.
Okay, as long as you're not a perfect saint, I expect something here.
Well, maybe you answered kind of like my second question, is that there were a number of individuals that you know really were very good friends with, and then basically the tables turned, and kind of like then in some ways either they betrayed you or in some ways they went
I
out.
will describe what happened, but I will tell you its outcome. I was offered the same thing to negotiate me out of my contract rather than have a bloodbath. I had offered Dan Golden. I was offered a full-time faculty position so I could buffer the degree of downward mobility in my salary, and I could be allowed time. I could stay as a full-time faculty member as long as it took me to build my practice back up, because that's what I wanted to head for to do again, to resume being a full-time practitioner. In those 3 years that I was still a full-time faculty member, that damn faculty that had assassinated me elected me president of the faculty. They suddenly valued me and wanted my leadership again.
Mhm.
All right. On that note, I'm going to end.
Okay.
See you next week.
All right.
Bye. Bye.
See you
Bye.
later, guys.
Bye. Be well.
Bye. Yeah.